Greetings, friends. Juan Ningrizka here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update for the week of February 19th through March 3rd of 2024. Well, not really a week, but more like 2 weeks. I apologize for the lack of video last week. I was on vacation, a little short one, but I couldn't make a video on Sunday, so I decided to make one video about 2 weeks. So we're going to be covering the time frame of February 19th through March 3rd of 2024, about the weeks on the ground here. And we actually have a ton of updates. And I thought, like, after as we mentioned last video, we talked about about the fall of Avdiivka here and how that played out. And I thought, like, okay, once this falls, it's going to, go back to the slow pace as it was before. But not so. We actually are seeing very fast progress by the Russian side on the Avdiivka-Donetsk sector, relative to the war, obviously. Compared to how the war has been fought for the last year or two, this is very fast gains. But it's not like a complete collapse of the whole situation, but it is very, very big progress, as we can see here. And I'm going to talk about like how this happened. So now, one thing you have to understand, I've been saying this a lot, is that the whole reason why they've been trying to storm Avdiivka, or just this entire area on the Donetsk front, the whole purpose of this is to push the Ukrainians away from the main city of the Donetsk People's Republic, the main capital, push the AFU away from Donetsk. And so operations in Avdiivka, operations in Marinka, like these are all connected to push the Ukrainians back, so that when they get pushed all the way back, the artillery would be pushed back, and then the artillery will no longer be able to shell Donetsk indiscriminately. They'll be able to shell them with HIMARS and such, but like those are very rare weapons. They are in limited supply, and the Ukrainians aren't gonna waste them just to bomb a random street in Donetsk just for terror bombing, because they need that to actually target civilians. While as for regular artillery, they could spare a few to kill a few to do some terror shelling. But so obviously, the whole purpose of this is to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. And so it's no surprise that just because Avdiivka fell doesn't mean that that operational objective has ended. That is just the first start. And so right now we're going to talk about mostly the Avdiivka front, because this is where a lot of the progress has happened after the Ukrainians collapsed in Avdiivka. So first, let's talk about what happened. So as we mentioned, not only did the Russians capture Avdiivka, they managed to capture two critical points that led to their success in these villages on the western edge of Avdiivka. The coke plant, along with the 9th District high-rise build quarter. These gave the Russians a dominant field view of this entire area. They are on the high ground now, and they are now on the offensive. And a lot of sources are saying that the Ukrainians basically didn't really expect they didn't really build as much good defenses. They have some trenches and such, but they're not as fortified as like this area right here, or because they were expecting the Russians to attack to the north or from here, but they didn't expect the Russians to attack directly from the east, because they held Avdiivka, so they're like, why the hell would we build trenches here or in front of Orlovka or in front of Lashtinka and such. They had very poor defenses here, and the Russians had an advantage with dominating the heights here. And so first what happened was that once there was actually a few days pause in offensive fighting, and the reason why is because Avdiivka fell so rapidly that the Russians had to take a few days to clear this area. There was a couple hundred Ukrainian POWs. There was a lot, there was a lot of mines and traps, and just they had to clear this area, and not only clear it, but also start using this as like a sector to continue their operations. They had to now establish this as their own defensive fortification. And so that took a few days to continue, to be able to clear that. However, after a few days passed, the Russians regained on the initiative. So the first thing that happened was that they started attacking Lashtinka here. And in fact, the battles for this village started right as Avdiivka was falling, because after they cut Avdiivka in half, they started pushing towards directly from the east to Lashtinka. And since there was very weak fortifications here, the Russians were able to start attacking in this village even before Avdiivka fell. And so clashes for this village went on for a few days after Avdiivka fell. And so the Ukrainians obviously didn't want the Russians to have like a base of operations so they could continue their offensive. So they held on for as long as they could. However, because the Russians had the coke plant, they were able to dominate and push the Ukrainians away from Lashchinska and push them back. And not only that, the Russians have been using fab bombs in not only in taking Avdiivka but also for taking these areas. They've been using massive amounts of airstrikes to basically dominate this whole area. And so this is a very, the Russians have basically are doing very well in combined arms warfare. They're using drones, they're using airstrikes, they're using tanks, they're using assault groups. They're getting better at these assault operations. Not only that, along with trying to secure Lashchinska, what happened is that while another place where the Russians had started to attack was Servina here, right here in the south. So Servina was defended in the south here. However, after they started securing Lashchinska and dominating the 9th District high-rise buildings, they managed, again, the same situation unfolded. The Ukrainians weren't expecting an attack from the east here. They were trying to suppress Russian troops from the south here, but they didn't expect Russian troops to like start barreling down from this area right here. And so this tiny area of Servina fell relatively pretty quickly. There we saw Russian troops hang their flags here and such. And so the Ukrainians, understanding that like the Russians are attacking them on two sides, retreated to Toninka, which was much more secure and harder to take completely. So Servina fell very quickly after the fall of Lashchinska. So the fall of Servina and Lashchinska basically gave the Russians, because of the fall of Avdiivka, allowed the Russians to have a little bit of a bridgehead in these villages here. These villages in Berdichi, Simnivka, Orlovka, Toninka, and all these areas was what they call the first Ukrainian defense line after the fall of Avdiivka. But as you can see, the first Ukrainian defense line is falling. The second defense line is around this area right here, in Novoprokhovska, Novosilivka, Pershi, Novobobovka, and then Umanska, and all that. And then the Russians need to basically take the second defense line. But right now they first need to secure the first defense line. And so after these two villages fell, another thing that happened was that we saw the complete liberation of Stepova. Now, we've talked about Stepova a lot in our previous videos. We talked about how the Russians were trying to fight for the eastern outskirts, the Ukrainians were on the western outskirts. This village has been fought over repeatedly, and it's razed to the ground. There's probably no village here left. However, this was when the Russians were trying to encircle Avdiivka. However, after the fall of the coke plant, the Ukrainians holding to Stepova basically became a death sentence, and there was no real reason to continue holding, so they had to fall back to more secure lines. And so the Ukrainians backed off to Berdichi and basically gave Stepova to the Russians. So Stepova, while it was the Russians had been in that village for a few months now, the complete conquest of that village only happened in the last week or two. And so the Ukrainians are like, okay, we're losing these villages on the outskirts. Let's retreat to a more defensive position in Berdichi, Semyonivka, Orlovka, and Toninka. And so during that week after Avdiivka fell, they basically conquered Stepova, Lashchinska, and Servina. However, in the next week, the week that the previous week, the Russians have continued their offensive operations. And so the first thing is that now they've basically captured Orlovka. I think about 90% of the town is conquered, and basically pushed to this like kind of reservoir. The reason why the Ukrainians have this as the defense lines because there's a lot of gullies here, a lot of some small rivers here that could facilitate a good defensive strategy here. However, the Russian use of massive amounts of fab bombs has basically prevented has basically negated a lot of the advantages of these natural obstacles. And they're not too big of obstacles, obviously. So the Russians have managed to capture Orlovka, which was kind of the center of this whole operation. So now, this defense line is split in two almost, between Berdichi and Semyonivka and Toninka. And so we saw the Russians raise their flag in the middle of Orlovka here. And so I think right now the front line kind of runs along this kind of riverbed right here. This village, Semyonivka, is still under full Ukrainian control, however, because they're using this kind of waterway as to prevent the Russians from continuously to advance. They also need to clear the fields between Berdichi and Orlovka, which are still that need to be cleared because there's still AFU forces here. Another thing is that after the taking of Stepova, the Russians have managed to enter Berdichi as well. Now, sources differ on how much Berdichi has been taken. So while Orlovka is about 90%, almost 100% taken, Berdichi, a lot of people, some like this Syriac maps has it only like a quarter taken. Some people say Berdichi is like half taken. It depends on who you're talking to, like what parts of Berdichi are still taken. However, there's been a lot of videos, and the first and what's interesting about as the Russians are trying to conquer completely Berdichi, which they're right now in the village, but they're still fighting over it, is that the first Abrams tank were destroyed here. Not only the first Abrams tank, the first 3 Abrams tank, and they're all destroyed in Berdichi. So obviously, whatever unit had the Abrams assigned to them has been assigned to this northern area to defend Berdichi, and a lot of these Abrams tanks have been getting disabled. And so Berdichi has fallen, or not fallen, but it's basically now being contested. And once Berdichi completely falls, the Russians will be able to attack Semyonivka, and basically, once Semyonivka falls, then the whole defensive point, the first defense line, will collapse. And so, if we look at this area, so Berdichi is being attacked, Orlovka has been taken, and once Berdichi completely falls, we're going to see Semyonivka fall. And so, again, this is very rapid progress. Usually, you would see battles over villages taking place over the course of a few weeks, but the fact that these villages are falling very fast is very striking. Another thing to mention is Toninka. Toninka is about 50% taken. Some people say about 80% taken. It's mostly this area right here that they say is under Ukrainian control. However, the southeastern parts, I should say, right here have been completely taken by the Russians. That is because after the advance on Orlovka, again, they kind of play into each other. So, like, the fall of like one village or the capture of one position facilitates the capture of the next position. Because if, for example, if say they took Serena, but they haven't been able to take Lashnica yet, they would have never been able to take Toninka, because then the Ukrainians will still hold the north, and they would be able to flank the Russians on the north. However, since Orlovka fell, the Russians are the ones attacking Toninka from the north, and thus the Ukrainians are on the pressure here. So Toninka and Berdichi are about half taken, or mostly taken if you talk to more pro-Russian sources. And so basically, in this course of 2 weeks, we saw 5 villages almost completely liberated. Stepova, Lashnica, Servina, and Orlovka have been basically completely taken. Berdichi and Toninka have been mostly taken. And basically, the only thing left in this equation is Semyonivka here. Now, at the end of this week, so starting around the beginning of March here, the Ukrainians are now on the counteroffensive here. So the Russians were continuously pushing, and they were about to take these areas. However, the Ukrainians said, oh, we can't let them take this whole area, because then the Russians will use this as their own defensive fortification and continue their attacks towards probably Umanska, and also probably towards this second defense line. And so I think the Ukrainians know that if the Russians take the second defense line, then the operational goal of this area, it will be complete. Because if the Ukrainians are pushed back to the Volchachka River, this river right here, and are pushed back to Orchecheny and kind of like up here, the Ukrainians are now back up here, and, say the Ukrainian artillery is up here, then, the difference, the Ukrainians, if the artillery is up here or here, they won't be able to strike Donetsk, because this is longer than about 20 kilometers and such. And so this is, they know that the Russians will achieve their operational goals. One thing I will say, a lot of people are saying, will this lead to like the fall of all of Donbass? No. Because, again, there's so many other the reason why the Russians are conquering these villages fast is because they are on a better position to go on the attack. However, the more they push, if they don't push elsewhere, then it starts becoming like a bulge. So let's say the Russians push all the way to this Volchachka River. This is probably the farthest extent they could push, because if they keep pushing towards, say, one of the next big cities of Selidova here, right? Then you see the Russians pushing all the way here, but the Ukrainians are still in the south here. The Ukrainians are still in the north here, and this little bulge that's kind of pushing here will be start being flanked. So they can't advance too much in one direction without advancing in other directions, because then their flanks get exposed. But they can achieve the operational goal of pushing the Ukrainians away from Donetsk by reaching the Volchachka River, because then both the Ukrainians and Russians will be in a position to have a defensive posture here. And so my reading of the situation is that they're going to be able to take Berdichi, Semivka, Orlovka, and Tonenka completely, probably by the end of next week. And then throughout March, it's going to basically be, the Russians are going to be clearing this area, probably reaching Novopropovska, Novoselivka, Pershi, and reaching this Volchachka River by reaching Umanska. And then with their positions in the north here, they're going to be able to finally end the battles for Peremyska and probably also try to take Natalova here. And the Ukrainians will retreat back to this area, because as you can see, they have a reservoir here. They have the Volchachka River. They have all these villages that they can use as defensive points here. And so, it's going to be very hard for the Russians to penetrate this area. So, but they'll be able to push probably this entire area from Novobakhmut to Natalova, and kind of have this be the new defensive position. Right now, this is the Ukrainian second line of defense. But for sure, they're going to take the first line of defense probably by the end of next week. Now, that could be the end. Maybe the Ukrainians manage to get their act together and solidify themselves on the second line of defense. And basically, the Russians will only be on this area and only hold Berezhny, Semivka, Orlovka, and Tonenka, but not push all the way to the Volchachka River, for example. So, there's that. And so that's basically Avdiivka. The battle for the first line of defense of the Ukrainians after the fall of Avdiivka started and basically has almost ended. But it's not over just yet. The battles are still going on. There are still clashes. The Ukrainians still hold on to Semivka here. They still hold to parts of Berezhny and Tonenka. But that's what happened. The Russians basically been able to use the advantage of Avdiivka to press on towards this first line of defense. So that's what's happening in Avdiivka, but there's also other areas to talk about in Donetsk, because you have to push everywhere in order to succeed. And again, just because they push in Avdiivka doesn't mean they've succeeded. Like, for example, Ukrainians could still have artillery here, because they have, this area has still not been pushed by the Russians, and they could still shell Donetsk from this area in the south. So the Russians are obviously pushing in the south. So let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, because that's another area where the Russians are pushing. And one thing is also that the Russians are trying to clear this village of Novolska here. The one thing that's tricky about this area is that it's all fields, and you might think that attacking in the fields is better than attacking in like towns, but that's not quite so. If you talk to a lot of Russians and Ukrainians even on the ground, they actually say they prefer fighting in the towns, in the villages, because they could take cover in the buildings. And it's very much easier to attack there than out in the open, because of drones, because of artillery, because of airstrikes. When you're out in the field, out in the open, and it's very much harder to defend yourself. And so taking Novolska is very hard, because there's only fields, and the Ukrainians hold on to the only place where there's buildings. And so the Russians advancing here have been having a very tough time. And not only that, this lays on the pre-war defensive front line. So the Ukrainians have very much strong trenches here to defend themselves. Very much like why it was so hard to break through into Avdiivka here. So, but however, that being said, the Russians have been advancing here. They are trying to basically utilize their advantage from breaking through in Pesky over 2 years ago almost, and basically try to kind of move along the tree lines and basically capture these trench lines in the south here. Now, there are strong fortifications. They take a while to take, and the Ukrainians still have roads that connect them to Ukrainian supply back more west. And so, while the Russians have been advancing along this tree line, trying to get to the south of Novolska, they're trying to get to the eastern outskirts of Novolska here. But the Ukrainians still hold on to the town. The Russians are making incremental advances here because once they take this town, they'll be in the ones with the building advantages, and they could start striking the Ukrainians in the fields here. But this is probably one of the hardest nuts to crack here because I don't really see much things changing unless once the Russians complete their operations in Avdiivka, and again, they all kind of interconnect with each other because let's say, as I mentioned before, the Russians take Natalova and Peremyska. The Russians could then advance maybe down here, right, and take these farms in the south, and kind of go along this kind of this kind of ridge here, and then they could basically hold this and attack Novolska from the north here, and this kind of attacking from multiple sides could lead this to collapse, and then they could be in a position to kind of have this be no man's land. The Ukrainians will be on the Volchachka River, but they won't be able to be out in the open fields. But the Russians won't be able to advance to these fields because it would be kind of suicidal. So these fields kind of act as a buffer. And so I don't really see the Russians taking these fields. But I could be wrong. But that's kind of why I see it. That's why Novolska is very hard to crack because of the open fields. However, the Russians are advancing to the south, taking some tree lines, and trying to get closer to flanking it. Again, and then also to the south here, we have more advances coming from the South Donetsk direction, which we'll talk about. First, let's talk about Krasnogorovka, and this is something that I did not expect at all. Again, Krasnogorovka is about as big as Avdiivka. It is a very big city. The Ukrainians not only have a big, their pre-2014 defense line here, they also have, the city also begins with a bunch of high-rise buildings here. And so attacking directly from Donetsk here, and its satellite villages, it's going to be very tough. So they can't attack directly. However, what the Russians have been doing is, after the fall of Marinka, this gave them the ability to start advancing into the southern part of Krasnogorovka. And I mentioned this about, I think, a few videos ago, about what's the goal of the Russians in the southern part of the to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. And so what I said is that they're going to try to go along this reservoir and take Grigorivka, and that is going to be the main goal of their operation. And because, again, they're trying to push towards Karakova, but they all, just because they keep advancing along this road, they are still going to be exposed to, they still need to push the Ukrainians out of this area right here from Donetsk. And so it looks like the Battle for Krasnogorovka has started. And one thing that we saw is that, a little while ago, the Russians managed to take this mine right here. This was this is the mine. The Russians managed to take this mine and basically have this as kind of staging area to attack, for the lookout to the southern parts of Krasnogorovka here. And so what we saw this week is that the Russians managed to enter the southern residential area of Krasnogorovka. And one thing that we don't know, we saw Russian troops battling it out here, but the Ukrainians are also showing themselves attacking here. So I don't think the Russians have managed to capture this area. And I think they're not trying to just enter Krasnogorovka from the south. I think what they're going to do, and I said this before, is, along this reservoir, but also there's also another natural defense point the Russians could use, which is this this rail line right here. And basically, if they establish themselves along the rail line, the Ukrainians will basically be forced back to kind of the central position here. The central part of Krasnogorovka. And so, but the Russians will have a foothold here. And so, while, the Ukrainians will be able to defend themselves on the other side of the railway, the Russians don't necessarily need to continue advancing into Krasnogorovka. They just need a secure position here so that they can continue pushing west. And because they don't need to attack Krasnogorovka, they're going to try to outflank it like they did in Avdiivka. Now, again, as we saw in Avdiivka, that didn't quite work out. They eventually had to storm Avdiivka after they surrounded it more, but they only were able to enter Avdiivka from the north because they attempted to surround it. So while I don't think they're going to try to completely surround Krasnogorovka, I think they're going to, they're going to advance along this rail line, and then let's try to advance up to this area right here and use this as a defense point here. And then once the Russians reach this area, the Ukrainians are like, oh shit, we could still be supplied in the north here. but then the Russians could attack Krasnogorovka and enter its like residential area from the west here, and so the Ukrainians won't be able to be prepared for that, and then this area will collapse and they'll be forced back to the north here. So they might not be encircled, but if the Russians hold this reservoir and be along this rail line, there's nothing that could stop them here, or nothing that it'll be a lot easier to put the squeeze on Krasnogorovka, which is the last Ukrainian big town in preventing them from pushing Ukrainians away from Donetsk. So the Russians are now battling in Krasnogorovka itself in these small residential area in the south. So we'll see if that continues. The Russians are also trying to push towards Grigorivka. The Russians have basically took the more eastern skirts of Grigorivka along this reservoir. However, the center part of the village is still under Ukrainian control. So again, the battle for Marinka took 2 weeks, and the Ukrainians had a lot of time to build defenses in here. So it's not like, Marinka fell, now the Ukrainians could hold on. Now there's nothing stopping them from reaching, the Dnieper River. There's still a lot of defenses. A lot of people on the pro-Russian side see something falling, let's say in Avdiivka or Marinka falling, and they're like, that's the hardest part. Now it's just an easy flow to the Dnieper River. No, the Ukrainians, while it's not as good as their pre-2014 defense line, they still have a lot of good position. They've been building defensive positions. It's not a complete walk in the park. So while they're not as good, like for example, as I mentioned, a lot of the defenses here is just trenches, not the concrete strong points in Avdiivka. They're still trenches. They still need to be cleared. So it's going to take a while for them to push towards Grigorivka. So that's what's happening there. The Russians are pushing here. They're trying to push them back to the Volchashka River in Karakova. Let's continue the south in that direction. Since we're in this front already. One thing to mention is also the Russians are trying to push one thing to mention about the last 2 weeks is also the complete capture of the village of Pojeba here. And this was a surprise. This is a very strong point that gives the Russians an advantage in advancing to the north of their goal, which is Konstantinovka, because the capture of Konstantinovka captures one of the main arteries of supply to Ugledar. And again, Ugledar is kind of the key to opening up this whole South Donetsk region. It gives them the dominant height advantage. It gives them a very strong place to defend. But in order, again, they tried to capture Ugledar directly, but that didn't quite work out. So they're trying to outflank it, and not outflank it, but cut it off. In order to do that, they need to basically take these villages along this river here. And the first step to taking those villages is basically, Pojeba is one of the first steps to that. And this has been battling over for a little while, but the Russians managed to finally capture this village. Hey guys, alright, so I'm sorry I had to pause the video recording for a second because something came up. I am back, however. Alrighty, let's continue where we left off here. Alrighty, so we were talking about the South Donetsk direction. And so in this video, the Russians are still putting pressure on trying to cut off Ugledar. But also to secure, again, I mention this all the time, but I have to repeat it, the southern part of the push towards Karakova from Marinka. Because again, if the Russians take Grigorivka here, but without advancing the south here, then the Russians can be attacked on their flanks here, from here. So again, the advantage on Pojeba gives the Russians a good position to continue their attacks towards Konstantinovka. However, again, like in Novolska, there's still a lot of open fields, and the Russians have a tough time. The Ukrainians too, out in the open here, and so there's a lot of it's very hard for the Russians to advance along these fields here. So we'll see how that works out for them. But again, the capture of Pojeba is a good starting point for that. One thing to also notice is that the Russians are also trying to directly attack Konstantinovka directly. However, they first need to crack one of the strongest points of the Ukrainian defense in Novomikhailovka here. And they've been doing that. And as we mentioned before, the Russians used to capture the eastern outskirts of Novomikhailovka. However, now there's a lot of advancements coming this way. In the last 2 weeks, the Russians managed to capture the southern industrial zone right here. However, the Ukrainians still hold this area right here. So there's still some areas in the south that prevent the Russians from completely dominating Novomikhailivka. Along with this, the Russians are battling inside these farms up in the northern part of Novomikhailivka. And these the capture of these farms and the capture of this industrial zone will basically not encircle, but will be able to allow the Russians to attack into the rest of Novomikhailivka and complicate the Ukrainian defenses here. One thing to notice is that the entire eastern part of Novomikhailivka is completely fallen. So while as in the before these 2 weeks, the Russians were kind of in this just eastern part right here, the Russians have now, because of some video footage that we saw with the Russians raising their flags, the Russians are now battling the center part of Novomikhailivka. This is the place where there is a few more, higher rise buildings here. And we saw the Russians manage to occupy this church right here. And so the center part of Novomikhailivka, where the the Rada, like kind of the center, not the Rada, but the kind of the center part of Novomikhailivka is now being contested. And if the Russians manage to capture the center part of Novomikhailivka, then the rest of Novomikhailivka is basically just, it's just one-story buildings here. It's very tough to continue their holding this, but now, the Russians are now beginning the culmination battle for Novomikhailivka. They advanced from the south here and are now battling for the center part of the village. And again, the capture of this village is essential because then this leads them to the main juicy target of Konstantinivka here. And so I could kind of see a situation where the Russians are trying to push from Pojeba to the south here, and then from the east here towards Konstantinivka, and then they'll be able to attack Konstantinivka on two sides. And so that's kind of what they're hoping. But again, there's a lot, the Novomikhailivka is being stubbornly fought over, and there's still a lot of fields in the north. So the Russians are making progress. They captured the Pojeba. They are now battling for the center of Novomikhailivka, and so they're making progress. But again, it's slow, and it's very, there's still a lot of work to do if they want to capture Konstantinivka, and with it, basically start the capture, and because the capture of this town here will basically start the battle to cut off Ugledar. So that's what's happening in Pojeba, Novomikhailivka. They took this village and they managed to capture about half this town. What else so that's basically what's happening in the Donetsk front. There's a lot this is where a lot of the main battles are occurring. But however, there's a lot of big news coming from Bakhmut. This is where another area of the front where there's a lot of progress. So nothing in the southern part of Bakhmut. But again, a lot of the progress is now coming from the northern sector. One thing to mention, I talked about before, is the capture of the Popovsky Forest. And the capture of this Popovsky Forest basically gave the Russians the dominant position to start advancing on the village of Ivanivska here, or Krasny. And as you can see, there's been a big change since the last 2 weeks. The Russians now occupy about half of this village. And so Ivanivska, as I mentioned before, is kind of the center of operations for Ukrainians in this eastern part, on the eastern edge of this Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. This canal is a natural defense point. It basically holds the high ground for Chasiv Yar and is the gateway to Chasiv Yar. So the Ukrainians are using this canal to defend Chasiv Yar, and they're doing that so far good. However, if they want to advance on Bakhmut, however, they'll need to basically have a position on this on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and the Russians are ruining their plans to hold this bridgehead here and basically force them back to Chasiv Yar. And because the center of all Ukrainian operations here was Ivanivska. So as we mentioned before, the Russians basically cleared the fields between Bakhmut and Ivanivska and managed to capture the Bakhmut dachas here and basically storm right directly in front of Ivanivska in the east. However, attacking Ivanivska directly was not enough. They needed to secure the Popovsky Forest in the south here, this area right here. And basically, the securing of this area allowed the Russians to advance and start battling for the Ukrainian trenches in the north here, and basically attack Ivanivska on two sides. And basically, because of that, the Russians have basically guaranteed that most sources say that basically everything behind this highway is under Russian control. So this whole area, most sources say this is completely under Russian control. Some other sources, such as Syriac map, has basically shown the Russians breaking into the center part of Ivanivska here and basically captured more parts of this town. And basically the main thing that will break the right now the only thing left for the Ukrainians here is kind of the center part of the village, with the government building here. There's like some not high-rise buildings, but kind of two-story buildings right here. You could see them here. And so, there's only a few more places the Ukrainians could defend Ivanivska. But if this village falls, that doesn't mean the Ukrainians are screwed, because actually this village is on the lowland. This just basically served as a center of operations connecting Ukrainians defending up in Bogdanovka, Kalinova, and such, and also by Ukrainians defending in Klishevka and Andriivka here. So the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to these two villages despite the Russians going on the attack. However, if Ivanivska falls, these areas are split in two. So what the Russians need to do is capture more of the high-rise places. They need to capture this forest right here. They need to capture, advance and take this forest right here. And basically put themselves along this canal. And that's going to be a tough nut to crack, because this is, again, on the basically as they advance towards Chasiv Yar, all these areas that the Russians are advancing towards, like the Popovsky Forest and such, these are higher elevations in relation to everything around it, which is why the Russians have been able to take this forest line right here. This is another trench line. However, for example, this forest right here is higher than whatever is here, because again, it's basically a general upwards elevation towards Chasiv Yar. So as the Russians keep advancing towards Chasiv Yar, they will always be attacking from a low position for the most part. And so this gives the Ukrainians an incredible defense point to defend themselves. And so that's why it's been a tough nut to crack. However, the Russians are making, they've captured half this village. This will split the defense of the Ukrainians in Bakhmut in two in terms of their defense of the eastern bridgehead on the other side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. The Russians are advancing, trying to continuously advance on the flanks of Bogdanovka. They're trying to advance onto this forest right here. They're trying to advance along this rail line to capture this forest right here. And they're trying to take the flanks, because once this forest falls, then they could collapse Bogdanovka and force the Ukrainians back to Kalinova. But since the Ukrainians are still stubbornly holding the flanks, Bogdanovka still holds a bit. So it's not necessarily a battle for Bogdanovka, it's a battle for like the flanks of Bogdanovka. So the Russians are basically on the offensive here. They are pushing towards the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. Splitting this area in two will basically hasten the collapse of the Ukrainians on this edge. And basically the big question I have is if the Russians could basically reach this, basically take these hills with the forests in them, because this is a very strong positions. These are on the high ground, and we'll have to see how well the Ukrainians could defend themselves here. So there's a lot, the Russians still have a lot to do in this area, but they are making strong progress. The Ukrainians have been completely thwarted from taking back Bakhmut, and now basically it's a battle for Chasiv Yar. Let's go to the north here. There's been no real changes in the Seversk front. The Russians, as we mentioned in January, December, the Russians were advancing here. They took Vasola. They were trying to advance along this rail line. However, the Ukrainians are now on the offensive here. So again, open fields. It's very hard to attack here. The Ukrainians are very strong with drones, and now the Ukrainians are trying to basically do counterattacks, just as they are in Avdiivka, to try to hold off the Russian advance here. So they actually managed to capture, I forgot exactly where, but basically the Ukrainians went on the attack and forced the Russians to step back a few hundred meters here. And so the Russians are basically just kind of holding in the fields out. They kind of pushed the Ukrainians away from this highway, which serves as a strong logistical artery. But again, if they want to continue pushing towards the south of Seversk, there's still a lot of progress to do. So the Ukrainians can't complicate Russian defense, but the Russians still have a long way to go to capture critical Ukrainian defenses. Same thing in Bilogorivka. Bilogorivka again is on kind of the lowland. The Ukrainians are basically on you can kind of actually see the trenches here a little bit. But they're on the forests that are on more of a higher elevation here, and they could strike down on the Russians trying to enter Bilogorivka. Because while Bilogorivka is... so the Russians, like, anytime they try to advance into the village here, they get bombarded from the Ukrainian positions on higher elevation. So it's very hard for the Russians to capture this village. And it's more of a symbolic thing because Bilogorivka is the major town in the Luhansk Oblast that that the Ukrainians control. Basically, kind of says, oh, the Russians might control 98, 99% of the oblast, but we control 1-2% of it, so they're not 100% in control of it. It basically denies the Russians the ability to say, hey, we control one entire Ukrainian oblast outside Crimea. So it's kind of more of a symbolic thing, but there are still clashes happening here. But again, the clashes here could just be to distract the Ukrainians from pulling troops to other areas of the front, because that's one of the big advantages the Russians have in attacking all over the front. If he told me about that, I would have said that's a bad idea. However, I think looking at it, it's kind of it kind of helps. One big advantage is that if the Russians are attacking in Zaporozhye, they are attacking in the South Donetsk area, they're attacking in Donetsk, they're attacking in Bakhmut, they are putting pressure in Liman and Seversk and Kupiansk. They're attacking basically everywhere. And this basically prevents the Ukrainians from just like, oh, they're not attacking in Seversk, okay, we could pull troops from here and put them in Bakhmut. Well, if we pull them from Seversk, then you're basically allowing the Russians to start advancing towards an easier time to advance towards Seversk, and this weakens this position here, for example. So if you attack everywhere, you can't focus a big army in one area to completely overrun the army, but if you attack everywhere, you basically freeze the enemy in place, and that's what the Russians have been doing with the Ukrainians. In the last 2 weeks, there's been very little changes towards Terny and Yampolovka, trying to reach the Zierabets River. The Russians got very close to these villages, they basically flattened what they call the Tuskoria Ledge, the Tuskoria Salient, I should say. And they reached, but they have not been able to reach it just yet. So, it's small success, but no. The main goal of reaching the Zierabets River has not been accomplished just yet, and there's been really no progress there in the last 2 weeks. And there's been Russian pushes in the Kupiansk front, but in the last 2 weeks, basically all we've seen is the Russians try to improve their positions in the northern area of Simkovka. But again, the Russians are making the Ukrainians are putting a very stubborn defense here, and it's because of this forest in here. And so it's very hard for the Russians to secure themselves in Simkovka. They changed tactics a bit, and they are trying to basically find a foothold here, and they still have a bit of a foothold in the village, but again, it's not letting them get any closer to Kupiansk. Same here. We talked about how the Russians managed to advance here and take Krolomovka and Tobivka here, but this hasn't expanded them to collapsing the Klishevka defense point here. The Russians are pushing here again to prevent the Ukrainians from moving people from Kupiansk to other areas of the front, but there's not been a big breakthrough to the Oskol River. In the last 2 weeks, there's really no progress in the Luhansk front, as I call it, or the Oskol front here. There's been some, talking about the South Donetsk direction, I don't think there's been any changes here per se. The Russians are still and one thing to mention, like for example here, every day there's always some video of the Russians bombing Ukrainians in like Urdizhina or to the north of Pryutia here. But again, so for example, we never talk about this area of the front, for example. We never talk about, but just because this area is not operational doesn't mean that this is like a silent area. It's not like there's nothing happening here. There's still bombings, drones, artillery shelling, but there's no advances to talk about here. But that's just one thing to say. One small thing also here is the Russians managed to capture. They advanced a little bit towards Gulia here, which is one of the main Ukrainian defense towns in Zaporozhye. They actually managed to occupy the dachas of Gulia right here. Nothing big. It just expands the buffer zone so that the Russians could have a better defense line here. This also is another area that's been very quiet. Now, one thing that has not been quiet is the Zaporozhye front. Now, the last 2 weeks, at the end of last video, I talked about how there's rumors of the Russians being on the attack here. And the last 2 weeks saw a lot of progress on the Zaporozhye front. Now, it depends on who, some sources. Now, one thing to mention here is that according to Syriac, the Russians basically retreated back to where they came. It looks like nothing changed here. However, if we talk to a lot of pro-Russian sources, they say the Russians have, we saw Russian troops disembarking and holding on to the center of the village here. So right here, and the Ukrainians basically retreated to kind of the graveyard, like right here, up in the north here. So the center and the southern part of Robotyne, according to Russian sources, is under Russian control. But Syriac says, they lost all their positions and they retreated back to their previous position. So I don't know who to, I don't know. We need to see more videos coming out. The Russians are also pushing out of Verbova and reaching the first line of what they call the Sorokin line, the first major line of defense here. So they're pushing the Ukrainians away from Verbova. They have, according to pro-Russian sources, they occupy half of Robotyne. And basically, a lot of, I think, again, the whole purpose of this is to reverse all gains of the Ukrainians from their 2023 offensive here, which will be a morale shock. But it's not like it's not like, a game-changing move. It's not like once they take Robotyne back, it's going to be open season towards Zaporozhye. It's just for morale purposes to weaken Ukrainian morale. So the Russians went on the offensive here, took about half of Robotyne, pushed most of the Ukrainians away from Verbova, but the Ukrainians still have some positions in the fields here. So we need to wait to see, to clarify the situation. Have the Ukrainians did the Russians just retreat? Are the Russians still there? We still don't know what exactly the positions here are. So we'll have to get more time to clarify where the Russians are after they did a big offensive here to try to retake Robotyne, or just the salient. Nothing happening in the Kherson front. Again, Krinky is still just being fought over, being cleared. One thing to say is, it's very hard to say what's happening in Krinky. Most of the village is under Russian control, but it's very hard for the Russians to fully control it because Ukrainians on these kind of islands here, are in a good position to and on the other side of the Dnieper River are able to drone and strike Russian forces in Krinky. So Krinky is still being fought over, still being, basically the Ukrainians aren't going to make any progress here, but, they could continue striking Russian forces here. One thing of note here is the Ukrainians try to do a suicidal operation, and I think it's called I forgot where it happened. Maybe it happened in the Kinburn Spit right here, or maybe right here. But the Ukrainians sent a special forces marine team here to occupy and try to take this area. Right, I forgot where. It's somewhere in this area. I think right here maybe, or right here. Maybe it was here. Something maybe here. But anyway, they all died. Yeah, they basically all died. They tried to occupy. They sent 20 troops here, 20 special forces Marines here, and they all got slaughtered. There was really no purpose for that except PR. So that was a waste of time for them. So that's what happened in the front. There's a lot of changes, especially in the Donetsk and Bakhmut direction, changes in Zaporozhye. However, changes in the Kupiansk and Kherson front, the Oskol front and such is kind of limited, to be quite honest. So the Russians are still doing their winter push. The Russians are on the offensive, and but it's still slow. Each side still has the ability to resist. They still have the ability to be in the fight, and so this war is still going to go on fast. It's not like, the Ukrainians are now in a tough nut that it's over for them. It's not over for them. They can still put on a fight, but again, the Russians have the advantage here. And in a war of attrition, the one with the biggest resources and numbers wins, and that's Russia. but it's now a matter of how much longer the Ukrainians can hold off that force. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this long video. I had to update you guys after 2 weeks of absence. Hope you guys enjoyed. So yeah, be sure to like this video if you liked it. Subscribe to my channel, see videos similar to this one. Comment your thoughts. Share this video around. And yeah, so aim high and wander on.